I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Patricia Cunningham's white Lexus pull into my driveway at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee, standing on the porch of my farmhouse in rural Clearwater County, Idaho, watching the sun come up over my barn like I did most mornings. The barn was a beauty, rebuilt 3 years ago after the original one from 1947 finally gave out. Red paint, white trim, solid oak beams, and positioned exactly where the old one had stood for nearly 70 years. Patricia stepped out of her car wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight, I wondered if it gave her headaches. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore the kind of smile that made my stomach drop. "Good morning, Harrison," she called out, her heels clicking on my gravel driveway. "Do you have a moment to discuss some HOA business?" I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing. "Patricia, my property isn't part of the HOA. We've been through this." "Well, that's where you're mistaken." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "After reviewing the county records and our association boundaries, we've discovered that your property line was redrawn in 2019 when the county updated their maps. A portion of your land, including where your barn currently sits, falls within Clearwater Meadows' HOA jurisdiction." I walked down the porch steps to meet her. "That's impossible. I've owned this land for 15 years. My grandfather owned it before that. There's no HOA involvement here." Patricia's smile never wavered. "I have the documentation right here. The county adjusted the property lines to accommodate the new water treatment facility they built 2 miles east. Your eastern boundary shifted slightly, which brings that portion of your property into our oversight." I took the papers from her hands and started flipping through them. Legal jargon, survey maps, highlighted sections that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense they made at first glance. But there, buried in the middle, was a map showing my property with a new boundary line that cut right through where my barn sat. "This doesn't make any sense," I said. "Nobody notified me about any boundary changes." "The county sent notices to all affected property owners in 2019, Patricia said smoothly. "Perhaps it got lost in the mail. Regardless, ignorance of the law isn't an excuse. Your barn violates several HOA regulations." "What regulations?" She pulled out another sheet. "The structure is too close to the property line. It's painted in non-approved colors, and it wasn't submitted for architectural review before construction. We're going to need you to relocate it, or face daily fines of $500 until the violation is corrected." I stared at her. "You want me to move a 40 by 60-foot barn because of some boundary change I never heard about? Or face the fines?" "Yes." Patricia tucked her portfolio back under her arm. "You have 30 days to begin relocation. The HOA board has already voted on this matter. The decision is final." "Like hell it is." I handed the papers back to her. "I'm not moving anything until I talk to a lawyer and verify all this." "That's certainly your right," Patricia said. "But the 30-day clock started yesterday when we mailed the official notice. I'm simply here as a courtesy to inform you in person. Have a good day, Harrison." She walked back to her Lexus and drove off, leaving me standing in my driveway holding a stack of papers and feeling like I'd just been run over by a truck. I spent the rest of the day on the phone, first with the county records office, then with a property lawyer named Mitchell Green who had helped me with my deed when I first bought the place. Mitchell confirmed that, yes, the county had redrawn some property lines in 2019, and yes, they had sent notices, and yes, it appeared that a small portion of my land now technically fell within the Clearwater Meadows HOA boundaries. "How did I miss this?" I asked him. "Did you move in 2019? Mitchell asked. I thought back. "Yeah, I was in Boise for 3 months taking care of my dad after his surgery, June through August." "There's your answer. The notice probably sat in your mailbox or got returned to sender. The county doesn't always follow up aggressively on these things." "Can they really make me move my barn?" Mitchell sighed. "If your barn is on HOA property and violates their covenants, then legally, yes, they can enforce their rules. But there are a few things we can do. First, we can argue that you built the barn before the boundary change, which should grandfather you in. Second, we can request a variance from the HOA board. Third, we can look for any procedural errors in how they've handled this. What are my chances? Honestly, 50-50. HOAs have a lot of power, especially in Idaho, but the fact that you weren't properly notified about the boundary change works in your favor. Let me do some research and I'll get back to you in a few days. I hung up feeling slightly less panicked, but still angry. The barn sat exactly where it should be, where the original barn had stood for decades. Moving it would cost a fortune, probably upward of $50,000, and there was no good alternative location on my property. The ground to the west was too soft, prone to flooding in spring. The ground to the north had too many rocks. The barn was positioned perfectly for access to the main road and for protecting my equipment from the worst of the winter winds. That night, I drove over to my neighbor Jake's house. Jake Murphy had lived in Clearwater County his whole life and knew every detail of local politics. He was in his garage working on an old Chevy when I pulled up. "Harrison," he called out, "what brings you by?" I told him about Patricia's visit and the HOA situation. Jake's expression darkened as I talked. "That woman is a menace," he said when I finished. "She moved here from California 5 years ago and immediately got herself elected HOA president. She's been making everyone's life miserable ever since. Last year she tried to fine old Mrs. Henderson for having dandelions in her lawn." Can she actually enforce this? Unfortunately, yeah. The HOA has been getting more aggressive. They hired some fancy law firm out of Boise to help them crack down on violations, brought in a bunch of money from special assessments to fund it. Jake wiped his hands on a rag. But here's the thing. That barn of yours sits right over the main sewer line that runs from the HOA properties to the county treatment plant. I straightened up. What? Yeah. The Clearwater Meadows development is about 200 feet higher in elevation than the treatment plant. They had to run a gravity sewer line from their properties down to connect with the county system. That line runs right under where your barn is. Has for years, since before they built the development. How do you know this? Because I was on the County Planning Commission when they approved it back in 2012. They needed an easement across your grandfather's property. He agreed to it in exchange for the county paving your access road. My mind started racing. So the HOA depends on that sewer line? Absolutely. It's the only way their wastewater gets out. If something happened to that line, or if access to it was blocked, they'd be in serious trouble. I drove home that night with an idea forming. If the sewer line ran under my barn, then the HOA needed access to my property for maintenance and repairs. That gave me leverage, but I needed to verify the information first. The next morning, I went to the county planning department and requested all the records for the Clearwater Meadows development. It took 3 hours and $45 in copying fees, but I walked out with a complete set of plans showing exactly what Jake had described. The sewer easement was clearly marked, running from the HOA properties through my land to the county treatment facility. The easement passed directly under where my barn now sat. I called Mitchell Green immediately. "I found something," I said, and explained about the sewer line. "Jai, interesting," Mitchell said. "Very interesting. An easement gives them the right to access that land for maintenance purposes. If your barn is blocking that access, you might actually have them over a barrel." "How so?" "Because they can't force you to move the barn if doing so would be unreasonably expensive, especially when they contributed to the problem by not properly notifying you about the boundary change. And if they need access to the sewer line, they need to negotiate with you, not just demand compliance." "What should I do?" "Sit tight. Don't respond to their demands yet. Let me draft a letter laying out your position. We'll point out the easement issue and suggest that perhaps the HOA would like to reconsider their demands." Mitchell's letter went out 3 days later. I got a response within a week, but not in writing. Patricia showed up at my door again, this time with 2 other people. One was a tall man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit who introduced himself as Robert Chen, the HOA's attorney. The other was a younger woman named Melissa Foster, who apparently served on the HOA board. "We need to discuss this situation rationally," Robert said. We were sitting at my kitchen table, and I'd made a pot of coffee that nobody was drinking. "The HOA has legitimate concerns about code violations, but we understand there are complicating factors." "The sewer line," I said. "Yes, the easement. We've reviewed the records. Your barn does sit over a portion of the easement path." "So you need access to my property?" Robert nodded. "Potentially, yes. The The line needs to be inspected every 5 years and may require maintenance or repair, Patricia cut in. But that doesn't change the fact that your barn violates HOA covenants. We're willing to negotiate, but you need to acknowledge the violation. I looked at her. I built that barn before the boundary change on what was unquestionably my property at the time. I was never notified about the change. And now you want me to spend $50,000 moving it because of an administrative error I had nothing to do with. The law is the law, Patricia said. Actually, Mitchell's voice came from behind me. I'd called him to join us for this meeting. The law also says that property owners who make improvements in good faith before a rule change are typically grandfathered in. Harrison built that barn with all proper permits from the county. He had no reason to believe he needed HOA approval. The permits didn't include HOA review, Robert said, because he wasn't in the HOA when he applied for them. The boundary change came after construction began. We went around in circles for another 30 minutes. Finally, Robert suggested a compromise. What if we granted a variance for the barn's location, but required Harrison to repaint it in approved colors and allowed us regular access for sewer maintenance? What colors? I asked. Patricia pulled out a color chart. Barn structures must be painted in earth tones, tan, brown, or forest green, no red. I looked at my beautiful red barn through the kitchen window. That's ridiculous. It's a barn. Barns are red. Not according to our architectural guidelines, Patricia said. Then your guidelines are idiotic. The meeting ended without resolution. Robert said he'd discuss options with the HOA board, and Mitchell said he'd prepare for litigation if necessary. After they left, Mitchell sat back down at my table. This is going to get ugly, he said. I know. They're not going to back down easily. Patricia Cunningham has a reputation for being stubborn. So do I, Mitchell smiled. Good, because here's what I think we should do. We file a declaratory judgment action asking the court to rule on whether the HOA can enforce these regulations against you given the circumstances. We also file a claim for an injunction preventing them from fining you while the case is pending. And we make it very clear that if they interfere with your use of your property, you'll block access to the sewer easement. Can I do that legally? You can't unreasonably interfere with the easement, but you can certainly require them to schedule access and follow reasonable precautions. If they're going to play hardball, we can too. The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. The same day, I received my first fine notice from the HOA, $500 per day, starting from the date of their original letter. They claimed I now owed $15,000. I didn't pay it. 3 days after that, I got a nasty letter from Robert Chen threatening to put a lien on my property if I didn't pay the fines. I forwarded it to Mitchell, who responded with his own letter pointing out that the fines were disputed and subject to ongoing litigation. Then, things got interesting. I was working in my barn one afternoon, servicing my tractor, when I heard vehicles pull up outside. I walked out to find a white commercial van with Clearwater Sewer Services printed on the side, along with Patricia's Lexus and Robert Chen's Mercedes. Patricia got out of her car. We're here to inspect the sewer line. We have easement rights. I looked at the 3 workers climbing out of the van with equipment. Did you schedule this inspection with me? We don't need to. It's an easement. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the photos I'd taken of the easement agreement. According to the terms your association signed, you need to provide 48 hours advance notice to the property owner for any non-emergency maintenance or inspection. This appears to be a routine inspection, so you're in violation of the easement terms. Robert walked over. Harrison, don't be difficult. This will only take a few hours. I'm not being difficult. I'm enforcing the agreement your association signed. Come back in 48 hours with proper notice, and we can schedule a time that works for both of us. Patricia's face turned red. You can't block us from accessing the sewer line. I'm not blocking anything. I'm requiring you to follow the procedures you agreed to. If you attempt to enter my property without following those procedures, I'll call the sheriff and report you for trespassing. Robert put a hand on Patricia's arm. Let's go. We'll come back with proper notice. They left, but Patricia looked like she wanted to murder me. The sewer inspection van pulled away, and I stood there feeling both satisfied and nervous. I was winning the immediate battles, but this war was far from over. Mitchell called me that evening. I heard about the sewer inspection. Good news travels fast. Harrison, you need to be careful. Don't give them any excuse to claim you're interfering with the easement. I'm not. I'm just making them follow their own rules. I know, but Patricia Cunningham is vindictive. She's going to escalate. He was right. 2 days later, after the HOA came back with proper notice and completed their sewer inspection, I found a notice on my door from the County Code Enforcement Office. Someone had filed a complaint claiming my barn was unsafe and needed to be inspected. The inspector, a tired-looking man named Dave Williams, showed up the next morning. I walked him through the entire barn, showing him the permits, the inspection records from when it was built, and the solid construction throughout. I don't see any issues, Dave said finally. Everything looks up to code. Who filed this complaint? I can guess, Dave sighed. Look, I get it. HOA disputes. I see this all the time. Someone's trying to use the county to fight their battles. I'll file a report saying everything's fine, but they can keep filing complaints and we'll have to keep responding. Can't you tell them to stop? Not really. Anyone can file a complaint. We have to investigate each one. Over the next 3 weeks, I got hit with 5 more complaints. Someone claimed I had unpermitted electrical work. Someone else said I was storing hazardous materials. Another complaint alleged I was running a business without a license because I occasionally sold vegetables from my garden at the farmer's market. Each complaint required a county inspector to come out. Each inspection found nothing wrong, and each one ate up hours of my time. I knew it was Patricia, but I couldn't prove it. Then, the HOA made a mistake. I was in town getting supplies when my neighbor Jake called. Harrison, there's someone at your barn with a camera and a clipboard. Thought you'd want to know. I drove home fast, probably faster than I should have. When I pulled into my driveway, I found a man I didn't recognize standing inside my barn, taking photos with a professional camera. Can I help you? I called out. The man jumped. He was in his 30s, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with an engineering company logo. Oh, sorry, I was just doing an assessment. An assessment of what? The HOA hired us to evaluate the cost of relocating this structure. I walked into the barn. Did you ask my permission to be on my property? I have permission from the HOA. The HOA doesn't own this property. I do. You're trespassing. The man's face paled. I was told this was HOA property. They lied. Get out. Now. He left quickly, mumbling apologies. I immediately called Mitchell and told him what happened. That's trespassing, Mitchell said, and it shows they're planning to push forward with forcing the relocation, but it's also evidence of their aggressive behavior. Did you get the guy's information? Got a photo of his truck and his company logo. Perfect. Send that to me. We can use this. The court date for our declaratory judgment action was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the harassment continued. The HOA filed a claim with the county to collect the fines they said I owed, which was now up to $45,000. Mitchell got that stayed pending the outcome of our lawsuit. Patricia started sending me certified letters every few days, each one detailing new violations she claimed to have found. My grass was too long. I had a vehicle parked in my driveway that wasn't properly registered, which was a flat-out lie. My mailbox didn't meet HOA standards. I documented everything: photos, dated and time-stamped, copies of all correspondence, records of every interaction. Then, about a week before our court date, something happened that changed everything. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of my phone ringing. It was Jake. Harrison, you need to get up. There's something wrong with the sewer line. I threw on clothes and ran outside. Even in the dark, I could smell it, the distinctive, horrible stench of sewage. I grabbed a flashlight and followed my nose to the back corner of my property, where the sewer line ran before disappearing underground toward the treatment plant. There was a leak, not a small one. Sewage was bubbling up from the ground, creating a growing pool of filth. I called the county emergency services line. They said they'd send someone out, but it might take a while since it was on private property, not a county line. Then I called Mitchell. Don't touch anything, he said. Document it thoroughly. This might actually help our case. As the sun came up, the scope of the problem became clear. The leak was substantial, and it was coming from right under where my barn sat. The sewer line had failed, probably from age and pressure, and now raw sewage from the entire Clearwater Meadows development was leaking onto my property. Patricia showed up around 8 a.m. with Robert Chen and an emergency plumbing crew. "We need immediate access to fix this," she said without preamble. "You have easement rights for emergency repairs," I agreed, "but we need to document the damage to my property first, and I want it in writing that the HOA will be responsible for cleanup and remediation." "Fine, whatever," Patricia said. "Just let them through." The plumbers went to work. It turned out the pipe had completely failed, corroded through from decades of use. They'd need to excavate under my barn to replace a 20-foot section of pipe. "How long will this take?" I asked the lead plumber, a gruff man named Tony. 2, maybe 3 days if everything goes smooth. We need to dig down about 6 feet, remove the old pipe, install new pipe, test it, and backfill. And we need to do it carefully because of your barn foundation." "What happens if you can't fix it?" Tony looked at the barn, then at the pipe. "If we can't get under there safely, they'll have to pump and haul their sewage to the treatment plant by truck. That would cost a fortune." I watched the crew set up equipment. They were going to have to tunnel under my barn's foundation to reach the broken pipe. It was going to be delicate, expensive work. Patricia pulled me aside. "I know what you're thinking, but don't even try it. This is an emergency situation covered by the easement." "I'm not stopping you," I said. "I'm just observing." What I was really doing was calculating. The HOA needed this repair done urgently. Every hour of delay meant more sewage backing up, more risk of contamination, more unhappy homeowners in their development. And they needed to work on my property, under my barn, to fix it. Mitchell arrived around noon. I'd called him to come out and observe. He walked the site with me, talking to the plumbers, examining the work. "This is significant leverage," he said quietly. "They need your cooperation." "I know, but you can't be unreasonable about it. Emergency repairs are covered under the easement. I'm not planning to block them, but I think it's time we had a serious negotiation." That evening, after the plumbers had dug the initial excavation and confirmed the extent of the damage, I called Robert Chen. "We need to talk settlement," I said. I'm listening." "The HOA drops all demands that I move my barn, drops all fines, and formally acknowledges that my barn is grandfathered under pre-existing use. In exchange, I'll cooperate fully with the sewer repairs, won't charge any fees for property access beyond what the easement requires, and I'll agree to reasonable future access for maintenance. I'll need to discuss this with the board. You've got 24 hours. After that, I start charging the HOA for property damage, loss of use, and environmental remediation. I've already had an environmental consultant out here assessing the sewage contamination. His preliminary estimate is $60,000 in cleanup costs." That was a bluff. I hadn't had anyone out yet, but I could, and we both knew it. Robert called back 6 hours later. "The board is meeting tomorrow night. Can you attend?" The Clearwater Meadows HOA board meeting was held in the community center of their development, a nice building with modern amenities that my HOA fees would presumably have helped pay for if I'd known I was in the HOA. There were 5 board members, including Patricia, who sat at the center of a long table looking like she'd swallowed something sour. Mitchell came with me. We sat across from the board, while about 20 residents filled the chairs behind us, curious about the drama. Robert Chen presented the situation. "As you all know, we're dealing with a failed sewer line that requires emergency repairs on Mr. Anderson's property. He has offered a settlement proposal that would resolve our ongoing dispute about his barn." Patricia leaned forward. "We are not backing down on the violations. Rules are rules." "Mrs. Cunningham," Robert said carefully, "we need to be practical here. The alternative is extended litigation that could cost the association upwards of $100,000 in legal fees, not to mention the potential property damage claims from the sewer failure." "He built that barn in violation of our covenants," Patricia insisted. Mitchell spoke up. "Actually, Mrs. Cunningham, Mr. Anderson built his barn on his own property with proper county permits before the boundary change that brought a portion of his land into HOA jurisdiction. The barn itself predates your authority over that land. That's a technicality. It's the law." One of the other board members, an older man named Frank, raised his hand. I have a question. If we force Mr. Anderson to move his barn, how much will it cost the HOA to repair the sewer line if we can't access the current location? Robert consulted his notes. The plumbing contractor estimated that routing around the barn location would require approximately 200 feet of new pipe, significant excavation, and possibly a pumping station. Total cost would be between $300,000 and $400,000 versus about $40,000 to repair it in place. The room went quiet. Plus, Mitchell added, if the HOA forces the barn to move, Mr. Anderson would have a strong claim that the HOA should bear the cost of relocation since the sewer easement effectively prevents him from using that portion of his property otherwise. That's another $50,000 to $70,000. Patricia's face was turning red again. This is extortion. No, I said, speaking directly to her. This is me protecting my property rights against an HOA that's been harassing me for months over a situation I didn't create. I built my barn legally. I wasn't notified about the boundary change. And now you want me to pay to fix your administrative problems. I'm offering a reasonable compromise that lets both of us move forward. Frank looked at Patricia. I move that we accept Mr. Anderson's settlement offer. Second, another board member said immediately. Patricia glared around the table. You're all making a mistake. All in favor? Frank called. 4 hands went up. Only Patricia abstained. The motion carries, Frank said. Mr. Chen, please draft the settlement agreement. I should have felt relieved. We'd won. The barn could stay, the fines were gone, and the HOA would fix their sewer line without further interference from me. But watching Patricia's face, I knew this wasn't over. She'd lost the vote, but she didn't look defeated. She looked angry. The settlement was signed 3 days later. The sewer repairs took another 4 days after that, with the plumbing crew carefully tunneling under my barn's foundation to replace the failed pipe section. They did good work, and Tony the plumber made sure everything was properly backfilled and compacted, so there'd be no foundation issues. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks after the settlement was signed, I got a call from the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. Someone had filed a complaint claiming I was operating an illegal septic system and contaminating groundwater. The DEQ inspector was apologetic but thorough. He tested my septic system, my well water, and soil samples from around the property. Everything came back clean because my septic system was properly permitted and maintained. But the inspection took a full day and cost me $300 in testing fees. Can you tell me who filed the complaint? I asked. It was anonymous, the inspector said, but we have to investigate all complaints. A week later, the county building department called. Someone had reported that I'd made unpermitted modifications to my barn. Another inspection, another day of my time wasted, another finding of no violations. Then, the health department showed up after a complaint that I was keeping livestock in unsanitary conditions. I didn't have any livestock except for 3 chickens, which were perfectly legal and well kept. It was Patricia. It had to be. She was using anonymous complaints to punish me for winning the settlement. I couldn't prove it, though, not until she made a mistake. I was in town one afternoon when I ran into Melissa Foster, the younger woman who'd been on the HOA board. She was at the hardware store, and she looked uncomfortable when she saw me. "Harrison," she said, "how are things going?" "Been better. Someone keeps filing false complaints against me with every county agency they can think of." Melissa looked around, then lowered her voice. "Can we talk? Somewhere private?" We went to a coffee shop down the street. Melissa ordered a latte and spent a minute stirring it nervously before she spoke. "I resigned from the HOA board last week," she said. "Why? Why?" "Because of Patricia. She's out of control. After the settlement, she was furious. She kept saying you'd made her look bad, that you'd undermined the authority of the HOA, that other property owners would think they could ignore the rules." "So she's filing the complaints?" Melissa nodded. "I heard her on the phone. She's been calling in anonymous complaints to try to make your life miserable. She even bragged about it at a board meeting, said she'd find a way to force you to move even if the settlement protected the barn." "Would you be willing to testify to that?" Melissa bit her lip. "I don't want to get involved in a lawsuit." "You might not have a choice if she keeps this up. What she's doing is harassment. It might even be abuse of government process, which is illegal. I just wanted to warn you. Patricia has a history of this kind of thing. There was a family in the development 2 years ago that fought with her over a fence. She made their lives so miserable, they ended up selling and moving away. I'm not moving. I know. That's why I'm worried. She's not going to stop. I thanked Melissa for the information and went straight to Mitchell's office. He listened to everything, taking notes. If we can prove Patricia is filing false complaints, we can go after her personally for harassment and abuse of process, Mitchell said. But we need solid evidence. Melissa's statement helps, but it's hearsay unless she's willing to testify. She might be if we need her. But there has to be another way to prove this. Mitchell thought for a moment. The complaint records. If there's a pattern of complaints all coming from the same source or same phone number, that might be enough. Let me make some calls. It took Mitchell 3 weeks to get the records through public information requests. When he finally spread them out on his conference table, the pattern was clear. 17 complaints filed against my property in 2 months. All anonymous. But 12 of them had been called in from the same phone number. Mitchell ran the number through a reverse lookup. It came back to a cell phone registered to Patricia Cunningham. Got her, Mitchell said with satisfaction. We filed a harassment lawsuit against Patricia personally, not the HOA. The complaint laid out every false report, every frivolous inspection, and every hour of my time wasted. We attached the phone records showing Patricia's number on the complaints, and we included a declaration from Melissa Foster, who'd ultimately agreed to provide a written statement. Patricia's response was to file a countersuit claiming I was harassing her by filing a frivolous lawsuit. Her attorney argued that reporting potential code violations was her right as a citizen and HOA president. The judge wasn't buying it. We had a hearing 6 weeks later. Both sides presented arguments. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that she was simply being a diligent community leader, concerned about property values and code compliance. Mitchell pointed out that 17 complaints in 2 months, all proven false, showed a clear pattern of malicious behavior. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Ruth Morrison, read through the phone records and the inspection reports. Then she looked at Patricia. Mrs. Cunningham, did you file these complaints? Patricia hesitated. I may have reported some concerns, yes. Concerns that were investigated and found to be baseless? I reported what I saw. 17 times in 2 months, and you just happened to see violations that professional inspectors couldn't find. I was doing my duty as HOA president. Judge Morrison shook her head. No, you were abusing government processes to harass someone you had a personal dispute with. That's not only unethical, it may be criminal. Patricia's face went white. Criminal? Filing false reports with government agencies can be prosecuted as a misdemeanor in Idaho? I'm going to grant Mr. Anderson's request for a restraining order preventing you from filing any further complaints about his property without evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person. And I'm going to order you to pay his attorney fees for this action. She looked at the paperwork. That appears to be $12,000. Your Honor, that's outrageous, Patricia's attorney said. What's outrageous is your client's behavior. The order is granted. We're adjourned. I walked out of the courthouse feeling vindicated but exhausted. Mitchell was grinning. That went better than I expected, he said. Is it really over now? With Patricia, probably. She's not going to risk criminal charges, but watch yourself anyway. Mitchell was right to be cautious. Patricia did stop filing complaints, but the HOA found other ways to be difficult. They started enforcing every minor rule they could against properties near mine, trying to create a hostile environment. They sent letters to my neighbors, suggesting that property values were declining because of my barn. They even tried to pass a new regulation requiring all structures within HOA boundaries to be inspected annually at the owner's expense. That last one fell apart when several homeowners objected and voted the measure down at a special meeting. It turned out Patricia's aggressive tactics had made her enemies within her own association. 3 months after the court hearing, I got a call from Frank, the board member who'd voted for my settlement. Harrison, I wanted to let you know that Patricia has resigned as HOA president. The board asked for her resignation after several other homeowners filed complaints about her behavior. Really? Yeah. Turns out you weren't the only one she was harassing. Once word got out about what she'd done to you, other people started coming forward with their own stories. The board felt she'd become a liability. Who's the new president? Me, actually. And I wanted to assure you that we're going to take a different approach going forward. The HOA exists to maintain property values and handle common areas, not to micromanage everyone's lives. I appreciate that. Also, we're going to be doing some updates to our covenants. We'd like your input, since you're technically a member of the association for that portion of your property. It was a peace offering, and I accepted it. Over the next year, things slowly returned to normal. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on actual community issues rather than vendetta campaigns. Patricia moved away about 8 months after resigning, her husband having taken a job in Oregon, according to the local gossip. My barn stood exactly where it had always stood, red and proud and perfectly positioned. The sewer line beneath it was inspected on schedule with proper notice and no drama. I even attended a few HOA meetings and found that when reasonable people were in charge, the association could actually be helpful. I ran into Melissa one day at the farmer's market. She was buying vegetables from my stand. "How have things been?" she asked. "Quiet, finally." "I'm glad. What Patricia did to you was wrong. I should have spoken up sooner." "You spoke up when it mattered. That's what counts." She smiled and took her bag of tomatoes. "Your barn looks good, by the way. I drive past it sometimes. Very classic." "Thanks. It's staying right where it is." As I drove home that evening, watching the sun set behind my barn, I thought about everything that had happened. The stress, the legal fees, the harassment, the complaints. It had been a nightmare for months, but I'd stood my ground. I'd protected my property and my rights, and in the end, the truth had won out. The barn stood where it had always belonged, where my grandfather's barn had stood before it, solid and real and unmovable. Not because the HOA had granted me permission, but because it was my land, my property, and my right. Sometimes you have to fight for what's yours. Sometimes you have to push back against people who think rules matter more than justice. And sometimes, if you're lucky and persistent, you win. I parked my truck and walked to the barn, running my hand along the red-painted wood. Underneath, buried 6 feet down, the sewer line carried waste from the HOA properties to the treatment plant, just as it had for years. They'd tried to make me move my barn. They'd threatened me with fines and legal action. They'd harassed me and filed false reports. But the barn was still here. And so was I. That evening, I sat on my porch with a beer and watched the stars come out. Jake drove up around 8, carrying a 6-pack of his own. "Heard Patricia's place sold," he said, settling into the chair next to mine. "Good riddance." "Amen to that." He opened a beer. "You know, this whole thing could have gone a lot worse. You could have given in, moved the barn, bankrupted yourself trying to comply." "Never considered it." "Why not? Most people would have." I thought about that. Because it wasn't right. The barn was there first. The HOA changed the boundaries without telling me, then tried to force me to pay for their administrative screw-up. That's not how things should work. Most people don't fight City Hall or HOA boards. Maybe they should. Jake raised his beer. "To standing your ground." I clinked my bottle against his. "To knowing where the sewer lines run." We both laughed. It felt good to laugh about it finally, after all the stress and anger. The next morning I got back to my normal routine. I had a small farm to run, equipment to maintain, and vegetables to grow. The barn stood exactly where it should be, providing shelter for my tractor and my tools, positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun and block the winter wind. About a month later, I got a letter from the HOA. For a moment, my stomach dropped, old fears rising up. Then I opened it and saw it was just the annual meeting notice and a request for input on playground equipment for the community park. Normal HOA business, the kind of thing associations should actually be dealing with. I filled out the survey and sent it back. Life went on. The seasons changed. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter, winter to spring. My barn weathered every storm, its red paint bright against the Idaho sky. I never did repaint it in earth tones. The new HOA board, when asked, said they'd be willing to grandfather in the color given the barn's history. Frank said he actually liked the red, said it added character to the area. 2 years after the whole mess started, I was working in the barn when a car pulled into my driveway. For just a moment, I tensed, remembering Patricia's Lexus and all the trouble that had followed. But this was a different car, a sensible Honda Accord. A young couple got out, looking around with obvious interest. "Can I help you?" I called out. "Sorry to bother you," the man said. "We're looking at buying a house in Clearwater Meadows. Someone told us we should talk to you first, that you'd have the real story about the HOA. I set down my tools and walked over. "What do you want to know?" "Is it as bad as some people say?" "We heard there was a lot of drama a few years back." I considered how to answer that. There was a difficult period when the wrong person was in charge, but the current board is reasonable. They focus on maintaining common areas and handling actual community issues. As long as you follow reasonable rules and don't try to paint your house purple or something, you'll probably be fine. The woman smiled. "That's reassuring. We really liked the house, but we were worried about HOA horror stories. Just make sure you read the covenants before you buy. Know what you're agreeing to, and if something doesn't seem right, speak up early before it becomes a big problem." They thanked me and left. I watched them drive away, thinking about how things had changed. The barn still stood in the same place, the sewer line still ran underneath it, but the relationship between me and the HOA had fundamentally shifted. We weren't enemies anymore. We were neighbors, trying to coexist in a way that respected everyone's rights. It wasn't perfect. There were still occasional disagreements about property boundaries and maintenance responsibilities, but they were handled with conversation and compromise, not threats and lawsuits. That's all I'd ever wanted. Not special treatment, not exemption from reasonable rules, just fairness and respect. Late one evening, I was locking up the barn when I noticed a car slowing down on the road. It pulled over, and a woman got out. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it might be Patricia, but this woman was older, dressed in casual clothes, and she was smiling. "Excuse me," she called. "Are you Harrison Anderson?" "Yes." "I'm Claire Thompson. I'm a reporter for the Clearwater County Chronicle. I'm doing a series on property rights disputes and HOA conflicts in Idaho. Your case came up in my research. Would you be willing to talk to me about what happened?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave the whole mess in the past, but another part remembered how isolated I'd felt during the worst of it, how powerless against the HOA's demands. "What kind of article are you writing?" "An investigative piece about HOA overreach and the need for better property owner protections. Your case is a good example of how boundary changes and administrative errors can create serious problems for landowners." "Come inside," I said. "I'll put on some coffee." We talked for 2 hours. I showed Claire all the documents, the boundary maps, the complaint records, the phone logs. I explained how the sewer line had become the key leverage point, how Melissa's testimony had exposed Patricia's harassment campaign, and how ultimately the system had worked, barely, to protect my rights. "You were lucky," Claire said as she packed up her notes. "If that sewer line hadn't run under your barn, you might have lost everything fighting the HOA." "I know. Most people don't have that kind of leverage. They just have to comply or spend their life savings on lawyers. That's why you should write this story. People need to know what they're getting into when they buy property in HOA communities." The article came out 3 weeks later, spread across 4 pages in the Sunday edition. It was thorough and fair, laying out both sides, but making clear that the HOA's handling of the situation had been unreasonable. Claire had interviewed other homeowners who'd had problems with Patricia, several lawyers about HOA law in Idaho, and even got a comment from Patricia herself, who claimed she'd always been acting in the best interests of the community. The article sparked some local controversy. The HOA board issued a statement distancing themselves from Patricia's actions and emphasizing their commitment to fair enforcement of covenants. Several state legislators were quoted saying they'd consider introducing reforms to HOA law to better protect property owners. I got phone calls from 3 other people facing HOA disputes, asking for advice. I told them all the same thing. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to push back when the HOA is clearly wrong. One of those callers was a woman named Sarah who lived in a development north of Boise. Her HOA was trying to force her to remove a solar panel installation that they said violated architectural guidelines, even though she'd gotten approval before installing it. Did you get the approval in writing? I asked. Yes, email from the board president at the time. Then they can't retroactively revoke it. That's basic contract law. Get a lawyer and fight it. She did. 2 months later, she called to tell me the HOA had backed down after her lawyer threatened to sue for breach of contract. Thank you, she said. I was ready to just give in before I read that article about your case. You would have lost thousands of dollars in solar panels you'd legally installed. I know, but fighting an HOA is intimidating. Knowing someone else had done it and won made all the difference. That's when I realized the whole ordeal had been about more than just my barn. It had been about establishing that property owners have rights that HOAs can't just steamroll over. That standing up to unreasonable demands isn't just possible, it's necessary. My barn had become a symbol, in a small way, a bright red symbol of resistance against overreach. 3 years after the initial confrontation with Patricia, the Idaho legislature passed a new law requiring HOAs to provide detailed notice before enforcing covenants against property owners, especially in cases involving boundary changes or retroactive application of rules. The law also created a fast-track dispute resolution process and penalties for filing false complaints with government agencies. Claire's article was cited in the legislative debate, so was my case. I testified at one of the committee hearings, describing what I'd gone through and why better protections were needed. Several legislators thanked me afterward, saying my story had helped them understand the real-world impact of HOA policies. The law passed with strong, bipartisan support. It wouldn't solve every problem, but it would make it harder for situations like mine to happen in the future. Standing in the barn one evening after the law passed, I felt a sense of completion. The fight had been exhausting and expensive and stressful, but it had mattered. Not just for me, but for other property owners across the state. The barn had stayed exactly where it belonged. The sewer line still ran underneath it, carrying waste from the Clearwater Meadows development to the treatment plant, a daily reminder of the leverage that had saved me. But more than that, the whole experience had taught me something important about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when everyone tells you to just give in and comply. Sometimes the barn has to stay red. Sometimes you have to fight for your land, your rights, your home. And sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and lucky enough and righteous enough, you win. I walked out of the barn and looked back at it in the fading light. Solid, red, unmovable. Exactly where my grandfather's barn had stood, exactly where it should be. Tomorrow I'd get back to work. There were crops to tend and equipment to maintain and a life to live. But tonight, I just stood there appreciating what I'd fought for and won. The barn, my land, my rights, all still here, all still mine, because I'd refused to back down. And that made all the difference.